Well, welcome everyone to our fall literary lectures hosted by the Antrim Literature Project. For those of you who may have just discovered us or are watching this online, we are an online public humanities platform run mostly by graduate students who want to just share our love of literature and knowledge with other readers. So our main goal is to make the study of literature accessible to readers beyond the university. And we're happy to offer this series of free introductory lectures on a variety of literary topics. Our sixth speaker for our series is Jordan Green. Jordan is a PhD candidate at Tufts University, studying British literature in the long 18th century. She is specifically interested in how 18th century theories of the mind and madness shape constructions of character and ways of reading those characters. And her lecture tonight explores the Romantic period interest in the Gothic. And the title of her talk is Were the Romantics Obsessed with the Dark and Spooky? Jordan, thanks so much for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining me on this lovely Halloween Eve to have this spooky discussion of mostly the Gothic genre and how that genre interacted with the Romantics and what that looked like in the Romantic period, and hopefully maybe posing some questions as to why, centuries of readers have been really interested in reading things that terrify us and, scare us out of our minds, and perhaps come up with a couple answers as to why, that has always interested us in the way that it has. And I would like to start with a graphic from The Guardian. So I'm going to post that in the chat, and then I'll also share my screen so that we can go through that together. So let me pull up. Oops, sorry, I didn't mean to stop my video. Just meant to make this bigger. One moment, sorry. I am going to stop sharing for a minute because it won't let me make it bigger. Okay. So this graphic explains to us how to tell that we are, what? Sorry, oh my goodness. How to tell that I'm just gonna go from here. How to tell that we're reading, oh my goodness. So sorry. I am clearly not very good with technology. One moment, please. Well, as you can all kind of look through it yourselves, but it essentially goes through how to tell that we're reading Gothic literature. And it comes up with these really lovely kinds of graphs and data pieces to share. So I definitely encourage you to explore that more on your own if you have time. But essentially, to tell if you are reading a Gothic novel, number one, the villain is often a murderous tyrant with scary eyes. And it gives you this very helpful kind of scale for scary eyes, from spine-tingling to hair-raising, blood-curdling, or can actually kill you. And it places some very well-known villains from popular Gothic novels for you to kind of see where they land. The heroine is often a pious virginal orphan who is prone to fainting. And here we have a fainting scale for key Gothic heroines and how many times they faint over the course of their novel. You'll see Emily here on the end, who is the heroine of the Mysteries of Udolpho, which is the novel we'll kind of get into today. She swoons a whole 10 times throughout the whole piece. These novels are often set in spooky castles or stately homes. Bonus points for being built in the Gothic period, being in a state of disrepair, in the middle of nowhere, being haunted or cursed, having a forbidden wing or secret passages, or having a reclusive or sinister owner. There's probably also a ghost or a monster. You could have vampires, the devil, witches, sorcerers. It's often set in the olden days, often takes place in foreign parts outside of typically England. The weather is always awful. It's always windy. There's always rain and lightning, never really any sunshine. Anyone who isn't a white middle-class Protestant is portrayed as frightening or monstrous or in some way other than the other characters. The laws of the land are often brazenly flouted, and people talk funny, right? Especially because most of these do come from the 18th century and the early 19th century. So there is that element to it. But as you'll notice, there are a lot of really recognizable tropes to the Gothic, and that kind of becomes a large part of what makes the Gothic, is this idea that it has these tropes that are highly recognizable, that are kind of plug and play, right? You'll create these stories and they'll often take place in these, dilapidated castles with wings that are shut off because they're falling apart, and our heroine is in this drafty room somehow away from all the rest of the people in the entire castle, right? It's dark and there's probably one candle, right? We can kind of start to imagine what this setting looks like. And it became a genre that relied highly on these conventions. And it was something that readers loved, and also people really attacked, right? Because of this idea that it was so heavily centered on these characteristics. But as you see from The Guardian, and as we kind of see throughout time, it often takes place in a castle, and it often takes place somewhere other than England, and it often takes place in a time far, far removed. And even though it was in a time far, far removed, right, in the medieval time, these books started to emerge in the late 18th century as a tradition that I'm discussing specifically here in the British context, obviously much later than the medieval period. So it was kind of a medieval revival, or a romanticism of medievalism, that allowed these authors to explore topics that might not necessarily be appropriate for a character from contemporary England to explore, right? These are questions of sexuality, of desire, of feeling, politics, religion. And you get to explore those in a time and a place far separate from where you are now. There's also these connotations that come with the word Gothic, right? When we're thinking of the Gothic, we think of, or the Romantics thought of words such as primitive or superstitious, when people were ruled by what were considered these more base or primal instinctual feelings of fear and wonder. And so the Gothic allows you to get back to those feelings and explore them, right, and reclaim them in this place where perhaps that might not have been, a priority in contemporary readings. And so the Gothic emerges, right, at the end of the 18th century, and it emerges first in terms of architecture. Horace Walpole purchased this very well-known estate called Strawberry Hill and renovated it to look like the Gothic style, right? He added turrets and towers and arched windows and doors. And even during the time of his life, people flocked to this castle. They thought it was so interesting. They looked at it. They went home, redid their own homes in this kind of Gothic style. And then Walpole was also one of the first to write a Gothic novel in the 1760s. And by the 1790s, these novels are flooding the market. They are extremely popular. Readers love them. Writers write them prolifically. A lot of the most popular writers at this time for the Gothic novels are women. And obviously in the 1790s too, we have this interesting kind of mixture of this emergence of this genre and the emergence of some socio-political turmoil, right? This is also the time of the emergence of the French Revolution. And what the French Revolution does is it demonstrates the power of the masses, right? You have these crowds of lower classes, right? Capitalist bourgeoisie, laborers who are overthrowing a feudal aristocracy. We have crowds of lower class people who are completely demolishing these social structures and these structures of governance. And it becomes a time of anxiety for the British, right? If this can happen in France, could we have a similar movement happen in England, right? Is this class structure and social structure that we have established, is that under siege right now, right? Particularly by the group of people who are becoming literate, right? We have a growing sense of literacy, and more people are able to read, and more people are demonstrating that they're interested in these books that terrify them, right? And it shows the power of these writers to move large swaths of people and manipulate them by but inciting their these feelings of fear, right? And playing with this idea of being terrified, and somehow that's pleasurable, right? This is kind of scary. All these people who can read and overthrow the government are interested in books that terrify them, right? They're interested in fear. And that's scary for some people, right? You can see the anxiety start to come up. And at the same time that this is happening, we start to see the beginnings of, what we would later call the Romantic period. And in Adam's talk, we had the pleasure of learning about some of the later generations of Romantics, right, who ended up becoming rather disillusioned with some of this earlier generation because they were in their youth so ecstatic about the French Revolution, right? The spirit of revolution was spreading and they were interested, they were into it, right? But as they got older, a lot of them stepped back from that feeling and became a little bit more conservative. And that became a place for criticism for the later generation who were really, revved up about these earlier expressions of a revolutionary spirit, and then disappointed when that kind of petered out later on. But oftentimes it was because these earlier poets and writers saw the violence and the terror of the latter end of the revolution and kind of were disillusioned themselves. And so this talk is focusing more on this earlier generation that was emerging at the same time that we have the Gothic flooding the literary marketplace, and we have these fears, but also this excitement over revolution. And so these early Romantics, as Adam discussed, were really interested in questions of the individual and creative genius and what poetic and literary expressions, right? How to exercise that genius and what that looks like, and also how we engage with that genius and the imagination. And so a lot of these writers were intrigued, but also kind of repulsed by this love of the Gothic, right? They were not so much fans of Gothic writers, but they were really afraid of the Gothic readers and what reading the Gothic did to people. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again. Hopefully this works a little bit better, to go over some quotes from William Wordsworth on his thoughts on the Gothic. This is my lovely homepage. So in his preface to Lyrical Ballads, which is a collection of poems written by William Wordsworth in collaboration with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, he is kind of talking about how he's working to create, this new language of poetry, this new kind of theory of poetry, and really concerned about the trends that are emerging in terms of what's being produced and what's being read in the literary marketplace. He says, "The invaluable works of our elder writers, I had almost said the works of Shakespeare and Milton, are driven into neglect by frantic novels, sickly and stupid German tragedies, and deluges of idle and extravagant stories in verse." And so here it becomes very clear in this language that Wordsworth is concerned that people are no longer reading, right, British writers. They're no longer reading Shakespeare and Milton and really immersing themselves in that tradition, but rather they are turning to these frantic novels, right? These novels that are written really quickly and oftentimes kind of mass produced. It seems almost like they just come onto the market so quickly, and they're frantic and they're frenzied, right? People are going after those. They're going after sickly and stupid tragedies from the continent, right? Really sad stories that were written somewhere else other than in England, where we have this wonderful tradition of literature, right? And idle and extravagant stories in verse, right? This is not poetry, right? These are just stories that happen to be written in verse. There's a difference here between, poetry and things that just so happen to be written in verse, right? And these things are all things that are diluting the pool of literature, right? And keeping people away from the classics and the really great works that were made in England, right? And this is a tragedy to Wordsworth, right? He goes on to say, "For a multitude of causes unknown to former times are now acting with combined force to blunt the discriminating powers of the mind and unfitting it for voluntary exertion, to reduce it to a state of almost savage torpor." So here, now the concern is that reading these types of novels does something to your brain and does something to your body, right? It is actively destroying your critical thinking skills, right? The powers of the mind to actually function. And this seems to be a far more passive kind of reading, right? There's a difference between tasteful, active reading, where you are actively engaged in thinking and parsing through what you're reading and making sense of it, right? It's a little bit difficult and you have to get into it to really understand what the author is saying. But with Gothic readings, it seems more passive, right? That you're just letting these tropes flow over you. You are immersing yourself in this environment of fear, not actively, but rather just letting it happen to you, right? You become almost lazy in your reading and in, your body. Like it changes the way that you can think. And that's really concerning when it seems to be affecting your ability, right, to actively engage with your work. So here we have a distinction between high literature, right, of Shakespeare and Milton, and these low, frantic novels. But we also have a distinction between active, tasteful reading and passive absorption of the works that you have. And obviously, Wordsworth shows very clearly where his preferences lie, right? And as we'll return to later, though, as much as these authors clearly criticize this genre, they also adopt some of these tropes in their own writing. Within the Lyrical Ballads, you have some works by Coleridge that rely on a lot of these tropes, right? Christabel and the Rime of the Ancient Mariner are both very spooky tales that I definitely encourage you to read if you'd like some short Halloween readings to kind of get you into the spirit. And so there's this allure of the dark and the spooky, as much as there is this revulsion at what it can do to the mind and what it does to literature in general. So why was it so popular for readers and authors alike when it also seemed to be so cheap and mass-produced and potentially disastrous to your ability to think and to engage with your literature? So to start answering this question, I'm going to turn off my screen. I'm going to read you a couple passages from the Mysteries of Udolpho, which I will have to give you a little bit of context. This book is like extremely large. So I'm going to be reading a couple small bits from it. And I'm going to ask you to turn on your mind's eye and really try to imagine these passages that I'm going to read for you and really try to picture what's happening for your own brain. So what I'm going to read is when our heroine, who swoons 10 times throughout the novel, Emily, is in the Castle of Udolpho. So her really lovely, wonderful, loving parents have unfortunately passed away, and she has been taken in by her aunt, who was tricked into a rather unsavory marriage with a man named Montoni, who was really marrying her for her money, but her money is entangled in her life and also Emily's. And so for him to be able to have access to that wealth, he has to kind of go through them. And so he takes them away to this castle in Italy, which is grand and wonderful, but also falling apart. And Emily happens to be in a room with this mysterious door that only locks from the outside and seems to be going to a set of stairs that lead who knows where. And she's away from everyone else in the castle. And at this moment in the novel, herself and her maid Annette are just trying to figure out where the heck they are. They're walking through, they're trying to just get back to Emily's apartments, but they seem to just be going through all sorts of tunnels, right? You're starting to hear these tropes, right? Going through all of these passageways, it's a maze. No one can hear them, even though they call out for help. No one can hear them, and they're lost. So this first passage, I'm going to try to differentiate my voices, but bear with me. But I want you to turn on your mind's eye and try to imagine these scenarios. So, how cold these rooms are, mademoiselle, said Annette. Nobody has lived in them for many, many years, they say. Do let us go. They may open upon the great staircase, perhaps, said Emily, pausing until she came to a chamber hung with pictures, and took delight to examine that of a soldier on horseback in a field of battle. He was darting his spear upon a man, who lay under the feet of the horse, who held up one hand in a supplicating attitude. The soldier, whose beaver was up, this beaver is a piece of armor that covers his throat, regarded him with a look of vengeance, and the countenance with that expression struck Emily as resembling Montoni. She shuddered and turned from it. Passing the light hastily over several other pictures, she came to one concealed by a veil of black silk. The singularity of the circumstance struck her, and she stopped before it, wishing to remove the veil and examine what could thus be carefully concealed, but somewhat wanting courage. "Holy Virgin, what can this mean?" exclaimed Annette. "This is surely the picture they told me of at Venice." "What picture?" said Emily. "Why, a picture," replied Annette, hesitatingly, "but I never could make out exactly what it was about either." "Remove the veil, Annette." "What? I, mademoiselle? I, not for the world." Emily, turning round, saw Annette's countenance grow pale. "And pray, what have you heard of this picture to terrify you so, my good girl?" she said. "Nothing, mademoiselle. I heard nothing, only let us find our way out." "Certainly, but I first wish to examine the picture. Take the light, Annette, while I lift the veil." Annette took the light and immediately walked away with it, disregarding Emily's call to stay, who, not choosing to be left alone in the dark chamber, at length followed her. "What is the reason of this, Annette?" said Emily while she overtook her. "What have you heard concerning that picture that makes you so willing to stay when I bid you?" "I do not know what the reason is, mademoiselle," replied Annette, "nor anything about the picture. Only I have heard that there is something very dreadful belonging to it, and that it has been covered up in the black ever since, and that nobody has looked on it for a great many years, and it somehow has to do with the owner of this castle before Signor Montoni came to possession of it, and—" "Well, Annette," said Emily, smiling, "I perceive it is as you say, that you know nothing about the picture." "No, nothing indeed, mademoiselle, for they made me promise never to tell, but—" "Well," replied Emily, who observed that she was struggling between her inclination to reveal a secret and her apprehension for the consequence, "I will inquire no further." So at this moment, right, Emily discovers this thing that is covered by a black veil. And luckily for Emily, she quickly finds out what's behind that veil. However, we as readers do not get the privilege of knowing what is behind the veil until nearly the very end of the novel. So Emily gets to know, Annette seems to know a lot more than Emily, but we are left in the dark. So I'm going to now read you the passage of when Emily finds out what's behind the veil. Same thing, try to imagine in your mind's eye. To withdraw her thoughts, however, from the subject of her misfortunes, she attempted to read, but her attention wandered from the page, and at length she threw aside the book and determined to explore the adjoining chambers of the castle. Her imagination was pleased with the view of ancient grandeur, and an emotion of melancholy awe awakened all its powers as she walked through rooms, obscure and desolate, where no footsteps had passed probably for many years, and remembered the strange history of the former possessor of the edifice. This brought to her recollection the veiled picture, which had attracted her curiosity on the preceding night, and she resolved to examine it. As she passed through the chambers that led to this, she found herself somewhat agitated. Its connection with the late lady of the castle and the conversation of Annette, together with the circumstance of the veil, throwing a mystery over the subject that excited a faint degree of terror. But a terror of this nature, as it occupies and expands the mind and elevates it to a high expectation, is purely sublime, and leads us by a kind of fascination to seek even the object from which we appear to shrink. Emily passed on with faltering steps, and having paused a moment at the door, before she attempted to open it, she then hastily entered the chamber and went towards the picture, which appeared to be enclosed in a frame of uncommon size that hung in a dark part of the room. She paused again, and then, with a timid hand, lifted the veil, but instantly let it fall, perceiving that what it concealed was no picture, and before she could leave the chamber, she dropped senseless on the floor. All right, so Emily at this point knows what's behind the veil. We know that it is no picture, right? And we know that it is something that has made her swoon, right? One of her 10 swoons happens in this moment where she completely just passes out. And that's all we get, right? Throughout the rest of the novel, we'll have hints of Emily recollecting what she saw behind the veil and shuddering and being concerned, right? We know that there are rumors that somehow it has to do with the previous owner of the castle who seems to have died under mysterious circumstances. We know it's been hidden away. That's all the information that we have, right? So as you're reading, you're probably filling in that image, right? Trying to guess what's behind the veil. And I certainly won't tell you today. You'll have to read if you would like. But I want you to think about that feeling of terror, right? And that's a feeling that a lot of authors, readers, and critical theorists at the time were really trying to figure out, like, okay, why do we like this feeling, right? Why do we like making ourselves scared? Why do we seek out this kind of literature? And a lot of people came up with some different theories, but I'm just going to kind of go through just a couple of the most important ones for us today. And through that, maybe come up with a couple of answers. So the first one was drafted by Anna Letitia Aiken and her brother. You might know her better by her name later on in her life, which is Barbauld. She is a very famous romantic poet. And her and her brother were kind of thinking through and wrote this essay called On the Pleasure Derived from Objects of Terror, where they were kind of just thinking through, okay, what is going on? Why do we gain pleasure from being scared? And so what they kind of came up with was the answer that, like, let me share my screen again. The answer that they understand the idea of sympathy. They get that appeal, right? The essay is often attributed to Barbauld. And she says that the exercise of our benevolent feelings are called forth by the view of human afflictions should be a source of pleasure cannot appear wonderful to one who considers that relation between the moral and natural systems of man, which has connected a degree of satisfaction with every action or emotion productive of the general welfare. Essentially, it makes sense that we gain pleasure from exercising our benevolent feeling, right? Our ability to feel bad for other people. That makes sense to me, right? Because the painful sensation immediately arising from a scene of misery is so much softened and alleviated by the reflex sense of self-approbation on attending virtuous sympathy that we find on the whole a very exquisite and refined pleasure remaining, which makes us desirous of again being witnesses to such scenes instead of flying from them with disgust and horror, right? We read tragedy, we read these horrible things that happen to people, and we read them again and again because it makes us feel good that we can feel bad for them. It makes us feel good that we're able to put ourselves into their position, imagine how they would feel in that moment, right? And feel their feelings. That makes us feel good as people that we're able to do that, right? That we can flex our sympathetic muscle, right? It is obvious how greatly such a provision must conduce to the ends of mutual support and assistance, right? It makes sense why we like this literature and why it exists, right? If novels teach us how to feel sympathy for other people, right? How to put ourselves into the positions of people who might not look like us or have lives similar to us, we can read about how they're thinking and how they're feeling and imagine ourselves in that position. This makes us better people. It makes us better people because we are better members of a community, right? We know how to engage with one another and feel their pains and feel their happiness and, respond in a way that we can imagine how we would want to be responded to. So we respond in that way, right? This makes sense. This makes us better citizens. It might also make it so that we don't revolt against one another, right? Because we understand how the other is feeling and we know that, revolution, it's not great for everyone. So maybe we can put ourselves into those positions, right? Imagine how people who maybe are not the landed gentry who own land and inherit these great estates, how maybe we can understand how they feel and treat them better. And maybe then we won't have them revolt, right? There's that underlying suggestion that maybe sympathy will keep us all in line, right? And this makes sense to Barbauld/Aiken, right? Literature teaches us how to be sympathetic, makes us better people, makes us better community members, citizens, right? This has a purpose. However, the apparent delight with which we dwell upon objects of pure terror, where our moral feelings are not in the least concerned, and no passion seems to be excited but the depressing one of fear, is a paradox of the heart, much more difficult of solution, right? Aiken's like, okay, sympathy makes sense. However, why do we pursue this feeling of terror that is characterized by the Gothic, right? The Gothic is characterized by this ability to create this atmosphere of terror. That's what makes it the Gothic. So why why do we like that, right? There seems to be no moral feelings attached to this, right? There's no greater good that comes of us being scared. So why do we like it so much? And the answer that they come to is that it flexes the muscles of the imagination, right? Not sympathy, but rather our ability to imagine, right? Here, though we know beforehand what to expect, right? We know beforehand that it's going to use a lot of these conventions that we've discussed, right? That were listed in the Guardian article, right? We enter into them with eagerness in quest of a pleasure already experienced. This is the pleasure constantly attached to the excitement of surprise from new and wonderful objects. A strange and unexpected event awakens the mind and keeps it on the stretch, and where the agency of invisible beings is introduced, of, quote, forms unseen and mightier far than we, unquote, our imagination, darting forth, explores with rapture the new world which is laid open to its view, and rejoices in the expansion of its powers. Passion and fancy cooperating elevate the soul to its highest pitch, and the pain of terror is lost in amazement. So we get the answer to this question of why were we obsessed with this? Because it allows us to stretch our imagination, right? This is actively engaging with literature. This is an active form of us having to, imagine what is being said in these novels, right? It's not very typical for us to enter into a haunted castle, right? That's not an everyday experience. And so we have to imagine what that would be like. What would the ghost sound like, right? What would it look like? What would it feel like to walk through these dank halls with only our little candle as we pull back this black veil to see what has been hidden, right? And there are so many rumors surrounding what it could be. What must that feel like? What must we see to make us fall senseless on the floor? And this guy, Edmund Burke, also takes up a lot of these ideas. And he kind of creates this formula or this theory of what he calls the sublime. And for Edmund Burke, who was an Anglo-Irish statesman, economist, and philosopher in the late 18th century, he believes that feelings of pain are much more powerful than those of pleasure. And that the strongest pain is this fear of death, which causes terror, right? That keyword that is brought up in the Mysteries of Udolpho, right? That feeling of terror. But this can be pleasurable if we experience it up to a certain point. So an analogy that is often used that I've heard is standing at the edge of a cliff, right? But I want you to imagine that you're standing at the edge of this cliff after a night hike, right? You know what's down there. There are some trees. Maybe you can hear a little babbling brook, but it's pretty indistinct, right? You see what you can see from the light of the moon, and you know that you're safe, right? You're far enough back from the edge that you know that you're safe, but it is vast, right? It is slightly obscure. You can imagine what's there, but you don't fully know, and you feel that kind of like pit in your stomach or that tingling on the back of your neck where you're close to that terror, but you know that you still have that distance, right? That's the sublime. Or staring up at the peaks of mountains and just seeing how absolutely massive they are and how small you are in comparison and how quickly those mountains could kill you if you were to hike up there unprepared, right? You know how to do it safely. You're just on a little hike, right? You're just walking and admiring the beauty, but there is that sense of danger and the ability for that beautiful natural scene, right, to end your mortal existence. And getting up to that edge, but not quite crossing over into the actual threatening of your mortal being, that is the sublime. And a key part of that, right, is that this feeling overwhelms our ability to reason, right? It's a state of astonishment where all motion is suspended. And your mind is entirely fixed in admiring this object, right? Admiring its brutal, violent capacity, but also its beauty and its vastness. And why I ask you to think about it at night is that this idea of obscurity is a key part of what makes things sublime, and why literature in particular can cultivate this feeling far better than anything else. So I've included a picture here. This is The Nightmare. It was painted by Henry Fuseli in 1781. And this is a spooky painting, right? You have this senseless woman draped over her couch while this weird creature sits atop her in a menacing fashion, right? This is not a kind sitting atop of an individual, right? There's something weird happening here. You have this horse peeking out from behind the curtain who's looking on in a disturbing way, right? You're unnerved by this creature peeking out. And it's an unnerving picture. And the longer that you stare at it, absolutely more details will come out. And you'll see more and more that will kind of help you to create an idea of what is being said in this image. However, everything that you need is here, right? There's nothing that you can pull from anywhere else that to kind of fill in this picture for you more than what's already here. And for Edmund Burke, that clarity makes it so that you cannot quite feel terror, right? Why literature can cultivate this feeling is because your job as a reader is to fill in the picture. You're given those details in the words, but you're filling in that movie in your head, right? You're filling in those details. You're filling in what's behind the veil or how you're feeling when you're pulling the veil back, right? And in that, you are co-producing your experience, right? With the reader and the writer, you are working together to create the image. And the terror comes from your ability to fill that in when not everything is there, right? When there's that question of what's lurking, right? It's that same feeling that you get, or maybe you got as children, I still get it, when you're at the bottom of a staircase and you turn the light off. And even though you knew, right, you had just seen in the light what was in your basement and there was nothing threatening, right? There was no one lurking. But as soon as you turn that light off, now you're unclear if someone has suddenly appeared, right, materialized, or if someone's coming up to grab your ankle, right? You run up the stairs as fast as you can. That's that obscurity that creates that sense of terror, because your brain is now filling in that darkness with images of terrifying ghosts or creatures, right, coming to get you. You're populating that and you're co-producing the scene, right? And so literature can make you terrified in ways that other forms of art cannot. And that's why the Gothic is so interesting, because it exercises your ability to flex that imagination muscle, but you're doing it in a way that's terrifying, right? You're filling in the darkness with these creatures. So to come back to Mysteries of Udolpho, right? Radcliffe takes up this idea pretty explicitly. It's like she read Burke and was like, all right, this is the kind of how-to guide for how to create terrifying literature. I'm going to give you my take, right? And in an earlier part of the book, when the characters are kind of looking over the Italian landscape and the sun is setting and they're admiring what they see, the narrator comments on this kind of phenomenon when they say, to a warm imagination, the dubious forms that float half-veiled in darkness afford a higher delight than the most distinct scenery that the sun can show. While the fancy thus wanders over landscapes partly of its own creation, a sweet complacency steals upon the mind. So in this moment, right, the narrator is noting this phenomenon, right? This scene, which is half veiled in darkness, we get that veiled again, right? That is a key phrase for Radcliffe, this idea that something is covered, right? We see only shadows, right? The sun can show you clarity, right? You can see distinct scenery, but to see it half clothed in darkness is going to give you more pleasure, because as your imagination is kind of wandering over the scene, it's filling it in, right? It's half of its own creation, creating this scene along with what's given to you, right? Again, it's a co-production between you and the landscape. And when you fill it in, you can fill it in with the things that go bump in the night and scare you, right? There can be banditti hiding in the woods waiting to steal all of your things, right, or kidnap you, or there might be a weird creature that only exists in this part of the Italian woods, right? And in the section that I read to you earlier, right, when Emily is thinking about the veil, right, and she's thinking about this connection to the late lady of the castle and these conversations with Annette, right, and the circumstances that the fact that this is the only thing that is covered in this chamber, right, these things are all going on in her mind as she's approaching the veil. And that's when the narrator says, but a terror of this nature, and remember, the terror is created specifically through this feeling of astonishment and awe and being paralyzed in wonder, right? A terror of this nature, as it occupies and expands the mind and elevates it to high expectations, is purely sublime and leads us by a kind of fascination to seek even the object from which we appear to shrink. So in this passage, we get this description of this thing, right? We don't know what it is. Emily knows. Emily will know for the rest of the book, and we are left in the dark the whole time. We keep going back to this. We keep maybe changing what we see behind it based on new information, but we keep filling in that image of what we think is back there. What would terrify us the most? What would make us swoon? And we're going to put that behind the veil, right? And flexing our imagination in that way is pleasurable because it is expanding the mind, right? It's giving this new circumstance that it probably has never imagined before, right? This is probably not a situation that you have put yourself in your brain before. And it's expanding it as it starts to exercise and imagine what that would look like, right? And so this kind of fascination leads us to seek these moments of terror, right? Rather than being terrified and run away, we are actively drawn to them because they work our imagination in this way. Now, as beautiful as this idea is, right, it's not one that was without its critics, because as much as this is beautiful, right, a co-production with the author and this ability to stretch your imagination and exercise that muscle, there was also the question of, okay, well, if it's pausing our ability to reason. We are not reasoning in this moment. Is this a good state to be in for the long term, right? Does this somehow make us live up in the castle in the clouds? Does it keep us from being reasonable, logical creatures? And for Jane Austen, the answer is yes, right? In her novel Northanger Abbey, she kind of does a satire of a character who is obsessed with the Gothic, and Catherine really loves the Mysteries of Udolpho, in particular, her protagonist, and kind of colors all of these scenes that she's in with this idea of she's this Gothic heroine, everyone's out to threaten her, right? This man who's invited me to his lovely estate has actually murdered his wife, because, that's what I read, like, that's what I know, that's my frame of reference. And so this question of the inflamed imagination comes up. And there's also a novel that was published around the same time called Nightmare Abbey, which was by Thomas Love Peacock. And he actually told Percy Shelley, he was like, yeah, I wrote this to make fun of this weird obsession that is happening right now with the morbid and this dark and spooky, right? We're all obsessed with the dark and spooky, and I'm going to make fun of that for this novel. And he creates these characters who hire people to work in their house based on how morbid their name is. Like, okay, you know what? This is creating that environment. I'm going to hire you. I don't know if you're qualified, but I like the vibes that you're giving me, and kind of creating that dark and spooky atmosphere, right? And so there's this critique, and you even see it in the Mysteries of Udolpho, right? I won't tell you what's behind the veil, but I will tell you that no matter what you've imagined, you're going to be disappointed. Because, that idea of obscurity, once you know what's there, once you have that clarity, the terror no longer exists. So even for Radcliffe, her character kind of has to be conditioned or disciplined out of this kind of terror that she's in when she realizes what's behind the veil and kind of rationalizes what she saw. So even in that moment, she kind of comes out of her terror. And so it's a state that seems to not be able to exist for so long. And again, that's a state that was highly criticized, right? That it's not reasonable, it's not rational. You're kind of engaging in these flights of fancy. And for some, this is a really mass-produced, not very creative genre because you're just using all of these conventions, right? You're kind of absorbing the information rather than actively engaging with it. And so there's all of these criticisms. But in the end, the Gothic is still this really interesting phenomenon where we're reading this literature not to make us better people, right? Not to make us better citizens, not to exercise these ideas of sympathy or to teach us some lesson, but rather because there's pleasure in being scared, right? The end of the Gothic is just to read, to be scared, and to enjoy that feeling and to have fun. And I think that there's a real, importance to just reading for fun and not necessarily having to have some better end to it. And the Gothic, in giving you these kind of really tangible experiences, right? This really embodied raising of the hairs or the back of your neck, kind of prickling up, or you just kind of shivering. There's a little cat coming in, a black cat to kind of finish off the story. But right, these are things that you can feel in your body, right? Not necessarily things that develop your moral character. And in that idea, it offers you this language and a practice for reading and engaging with literature, right? One where you are co-producing your experience, and you're doing so just for the pleasure of enjoying that feeling that you get in your body, right? And that's something that people who enjoy the Gothic then and the Gothic now can kind of agree on is, this is just a different way to approach the way I'm reading. And so I encourage you tomorrow to read your spooky story, to allow yourself to get scared, right? To create the conditions, maybe sit in a dark corner of your room, right? Cuddle up in a blanket and just allow yourself to feel those feelings, because they are a valid way to engage with literature, and one that, we've been engaging with for centuries. So thank you.